Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Thanks, Krishna. It's fine. Thank you. Gopi Jana Palapa Girivaradari Yasodanandana Praja Jana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this morning we're reading from Canto 10, chapter 58, and the text is 7, 8, and 9. So we'll chant text 7 together. Pritam Samagachya Krita Vivadanas. Tayati Hadardra Drishabiram Pitaha. Aprishtavam Stam Kushalam Sahasnusham. Pitirasvasharam Pariprishta Bandavam. Pritam Samagachya Krita Vivadanas. Tayati Hadadra Drishabiram Vitsaham. Aprishtavam Stam Kushalam Sahasnusham. Pitirasvasharam Pariprishta Bandavam. Pritam Samagachya Krita Vivadanas. Tayati Hadadra Drishabiram Vitaha. Aprishtavam Stam Kushalam Sahasnusham. Pitirasvasharam Pariprishta Bandavam. Please chant. Pritam Samagachya Krita Vivadanas. Tayati Hadadra Drishabiram Vita. Aprishtavam Stam Kushalam Sahasnusham. Pitirasvasharam Pariprishta Bandava. Pritam Samagachya Krita Vivadanas. Tayati Hadadra Drishabiram Vita. Aprishtavam Stam Kushalam Sahasnusham. Pitirasvasharam Pariprishta Bandava. Pritam Samagachya Krita Vivadanas. Tayati Hadadra Drishabiram Vita. Aprishtaram Stam Kushalam Sahasnusham. Pitirasvasharam Pariprishta Bandavam. And the word for word, Pritam, to Queen Kunti. Samagachya, going. Krita, offering. Abhivadana, his obeisances. Taya, by her. Ati, extreme. Harda, with affection. Ardra, wet. Dosha, whose eyes. Abhirambuta, embraced. Aprishtavan, he asked. Tam, from her. Kushalam, about her welfare. Saha, together. Snasham, with her daughter-in-law Draupadi. Pitir, of his father. Vasudeva. Svasharam, the sister. Pariprishta, inquired in detail. Bandava, about their relatives living in Dwarka. So the translation for text 7 is as follows. The Lord then went to see his aunt, Queen Kunti. He bowed down to her, and she embraced him, her eyes moist with great affection. Lord Krishna inquired from her and her daughter-in-law Draupadi about their welfare, and they in turn questioned him at length about his relatives in Dwarka. And purport by the disciples of Srila Prabhupada. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur envisions that as Krishna was sitting on his seat, he saw his Aunt Kunti approaching in great eagerness to see him. He then rose at once, quickly went up to her, and offered his obeisances. Her eyes moistened with extreme love. She embraced him and smelled his head. And text 8. Tadaiva kushalam no but sa nataste krita vayam natina smarata Krishna pratame preshitas tvayam. And the translation for text 8. So overcome by love that her throat choked up and her eyes filled with tears, Queen Kunti remembered the many troubles she and her sons had endured. Thus she addressed Lord Krishna, who appears before his devotees to drive away their distress. Text 9. Gosh, I didn't, okay. Tadaiva koshalam no but sa nataste kriti vayam natina smarata Krishna bharatama preshitas tvayam. Yes, I did read, sorry, that was text 9, yeah. Okay. So I didn't read text 8, sorry. Anyway, text 9, the translation. Queen Kunti said, My dear Krishna, our welfare was assured only when you remembered us, your relatives, and gave us your protection by sending my brother to visit us. Om Jnana Timirandasya Gananjana Shlakaya Chakshuru Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uta Padakamlam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Sha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Ragutam Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bando Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha Namom Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimati Ramapada Swami Iti Namine Namom Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nivishesha Sunyavadi Paschacha Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So the first text text 7, the BBT purport was referring to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's writing. So from Sarata Darshini, this is what Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur writes. Seeing Kunti approaching with great eagerness to see him, Krishna rose at once from his seat, quickly went up to her and offered his obeisances. Her eyes moistened with extreme love, Ati Hridena Ati Prema. So this is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur doing an analysis. He consults the Amara Kosha dictionary and he says, Prema va Priyata Hardam. So Priyata and Hardam are synonyms for pure love. So he does an analysis. So that means Prema of Krishna. So if we take a look at what is the definition of Prema, this is that definition, and this is Srila Rupa Goswami's definition of pure love or Prema of Krishna. When bhava becomes extremely condensed, it is called Prema by the learned. It softens the heart and produces extreme possessiveness of the Lord in the experience. And that's from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So in Prema, this pure love, the heart becomes extremely soft in comparison to the previous stage or preliminary condition of bhava, in which the heart is also soft, but Prema is the heart is so softened that it's called condensed bliss. So I guess it's like, when you making burfi and you stirring and stirring milk, then all the moisture that's in the milk, the water component starts evaporating and the milk becomes very thick, very condensed. That's the word that's used. So it's super sweet, super condensed. That's how the heart is in Prema. It's very, very soft. So this highest state of bliss is compared to the preliminary stage of bhava. So it's leading up to this condensed state, but already there's bliss in the heart. And in the bhava stage, the previous stage, there's this preliminary appearance of bliss. It's just the beginning. And here Kunti is described in this way. Her eyes moistened with extreme love. And based on the definition that we've just heard from Srila Rupa Goswami, is obviously the extreme possessiveness of Krishna. We have to understand that, infer it based on the definition of Prema, because she's described as having extreme love. Now, there's a further analysis in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu in the first volume, and that is that bhava, the previous stage, where there's, this beginning of bliss and beginning of love, bhava is called Prema by Bhishma and others when there is possessiveness related to Lord Vishnu, and where possessiveness of other things is absent. So that's a refinement of this definition of pure love or Prema. It means that there's the possessiveness, but there's also no possessiveness of anything else. So it's a pretty exclusive sense of possessiveness in relation to Lord Vishnu or Lord Krishna. And I'm going to read that particular verse just because it's significant in this particular discussion. Bhakta premachyate bhishma muyati yatratu sangata mama tanyap mamatvena parichetyatva yojana. So Srila Vishwanath comments on this verse from Pancharatra, because that's where it's been drawn from, so deity worship. Bhakti itself, or devotion to Lord Krishna, Lord Vishnu, means bhava. That's Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur commenting. it means that there's going to be this bliss in the heart. There's going to be love for Krishna. So bhakti means it should be devoid of you're hearing the opposite of what happens in prema. There can't be strong possessiveness of the body. You can't have that working together with bhakti, or having a strong possessiveness for a house or other items. It can't go along with bhakti. And Srila Vishwanath does, however, add that if there's possessiveness related to Lord Krishna, of course, reiterating the previous definition we heard, it's called prema. So no possessiveness of body, house, other objects, but then when there starts to be possessiveness of Lord Krishna, then it's that stage of prema. So there's a beautiful prayer of Queen Kunti. And this is coming from teachings of Queen Kunti, Srila Prabhupada, which illustrates this awareness of not being possessive. And in her case, she's looking at her possessiveness of her sons and her relatives, which is interesting. They're persons that are very close to her. And this is how she prays. So taking into account what the condition of her heart is, and that we understand that there's a sense of possessiveness of Lord Krishna, this is how she's praying. O Lord of the universe, soul of the universe, O personality of the form of the universe, please therefore sever my tie of affection for my kinsmen, the Pandavas and the Vrishnis. So she wants her tie of affection, it's binding her to her relatives, her sons, to actually be severed. Very exalted, but this is this condition of, or this state of prema or pure love for Krishna. And in fact, this particular verse does appear in the Srimad Bhagavatam in the first canto and the 8th chapter. As Srila Prabhupada explains, this is very interesting because for Queen Kunti, the Pandavas are her own sons, and the Vrishnis are the members of her paternal family. So both the families required Lord Krishna's help. I mean, we've been hearing some of the, through the various classes, how her sons at any rate were, and herself with her sons were having to undergo various difficulties. So Srila Prabhupada is explaining that the Pandavas required her help, and the Vrishnis, the paternal family, also required Lord Krishna's help, because both were dependent devotees of the Lord. So Kunti Devi, she's wishing for Krishna to remain with her sons, the Pandavas, but if he does that, this is how she's thinking, her paternal house would be bereft of his benefit. So this is how she's thinking. She wants Krishna to be with her sons because obviously there's understanding of the dangers coming from the Kurus in relation to the Pandavas. But then she's concerned, Krishna can't be with the Vrishnis then. This is how she's thinking. So to resolve the conflict in her mind, the mind is troubled, and therefore she desires to cut off the affectionate tie for both. This is how Srila Prabhupada explains it. So Srila Prabhupada, he generalizes, and he says, a pure devotee of the Lord is ashamed to ask for anything in self-interest, and in fact cuts off the ties of limited affection for his family and widens his activities of devotional service for all forgotten souls. So notice, there's a recognition that any tie one has, there's a limitation there. So for a very exalted devotee with this very softened heart, feeling very possessive of Lord Krishna, they widen their activities of devotional service. So it's not just in relation to their family members or their duties, but they try to broaden it because they want to take into account all forgotten souls. So in the case of Queen Kunti, And it's the same for a brahmana or a devotee, a king, or a public figure, particularly a public leader. There's a necessity to be broad-minded in discharging one's respective duties. I mean, you see, like we live in a country where, it may be mentioned, the previous president I will comment, appeared to lack that kind of broad-mindedness where he actually focused on particular groups that would support him. So this showed this kind of not taking everyone into account. And that isn't the proper perspective on the part of a leader. There has to be a broad-mindedness. And the interesting part is that at least what's been illustrated in the case of Queen Kunti, who's in that position of royal leadership, although she and her sons are being banished and being usurped from their rightful rule, there is this awareness that there's the necessity to not be so attached to one's immediate relatives and very close family members like her sons, because this will permit that kind of broad-mindedness. Yeah, and in fact, you even find, again, a comment in terms of the politics that existed, a public leader in the country we're residing in. There was placing all the family members in very prominent positions, and not necessarily that the family members were qualified. So again, that's that attachment, visible attachment, that obviously is not the proper perspective for a person in a leadership position. So Queen Kunti was very conscious of this fact of how she was discharging her duties. And she's seen herself as being weak. And so she's praying to be free from the bondage of family affection. So that's that idea, one expands one's capacities and removes things that narrow one's outlook and therefore, brings bias to the fore, which is to the detriment of oneself and the entire population one is supposed to be serving. So Srila Rupa Goswami writes further on Prema. This is what he says. Prema with knowledge of the Lord's sweetness arising from the Lord's mercy is described in the Pancharatra. That bhakti inundated with prema, with continuous spontaneous desire to please the Lord, free of desires for other results, even the desire to see his powers, brings even Vishnu under control. So extraordinary. One's in a position of leadership, but because one is actually, practicing in this kind of way, wanting to please the Lord, then it brings even Lord Vishnu under control. So extraordinary. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is in control of all the universes. Even he comes under the control of a leader or person in a leadership position who's actually functioning with this desire to just please the Lord, free of desires for other results. So this continuous, spontaneous desire to please the Lord, free of desires for other results, is clear in the case of Queen Kunti. And there's another prayer which reveals this. This is Queen Kunti praying. I wish that all those calamities would happen again and again, so that we could see you again and again. So this is a fascinating prayer, because she says, for seeing you means that we will no longer see repeated birth and death. So you see the incredible broad-mindedness. Queen Kunti, in this current reading, she's actually seeing Lord Krishna. And she's remembering those occasions of extreme misfortune and sorrow. And this is what text 8 that we read says. So overcome with love that her throat choked up and her eyes filled with tears, Queen Kunti remembered the many troubles she and her sons had endured. Thus she addressed Lord Krishna, who appears before his devotees to drive away their distress. So Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he states that Kunti spoke to Lord Krishna, whose body, Atma Darshanam, Anga Darshanam, so darshan of the Supreme Soul and darshan of his limbs, it extinguishes all misery. So this is Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur saying. So one can even think that coming before the deity. It extinguishes all misery. So that removal of misery is due to relishing the sweetness of Krishna's body in the mind. So one has that experience too. One comes to the greeting of the deities and one is seeing the beautiful forms of the deities and the way that, some simulated rubies are placed on the wrists, or simulated rubies are placed around the ankles, or the very graceful way in which Krishna is holding his walking stick or his flute. So just actually relishing that in the mind, it actually is extinguishing any misery oneself has, be it of one's body, one's own mind, or something that somebody else has brought about in one's life. So this is Srila Vishwanath. He's the ocean of beauty. And the luster of his body and the beauty of his face and smile are all attractive to the minds of the gopis. And this is quoting from Lord Chaitanya, because this is what Lord Chaitanya stated about Lord Krishna, explaining something of the transcendental constitution of Lord Krishna and his body. So I'll just repeat it because it's extraordinary. This is Lord Chaitanya's simple teaching on this particular point. He's the ocean of beauty, and the luster of his body and the beauty of his face and smile are all attractive to the minds of the gopis. So that same point, how it is that Krishna's form, or having darshan of his form, actually destroys misery. It's because one can relish in the mind the beauty of Lord Krishna. And indeed, transcendental liberated personalities, such as the gopis of Vrindavan and Rukmini, the original goddess of fortune, they were constantly meditating on the Lord's spiritual body. And great liberators, sages, having heard about Krishna's body, they couldn't take it out of their hearts. So we hear about that all the time. And this is described in Srimad Bhagavatam 11:30. Once their eyes were fixed upon his transcendental form, women were unable to withdraw them. And once that form entered the ears of the sages and becomes fixed in their hearts, it would never depart. What to speak of acquiring fame? The great poets who describe the beauty of the Lord's form would have their words invested with transcendently pleasing attraction. And by seeing that form on Arjuna's chariot, all the warriors on the battlefield of Kurukshetra attained the liberation of gaining a spiritual body similar to the Lord's. So extraordinary, the power of just having this darshan of Lord Krishna's beautiful form, that in the case of the warriors on the battlefield, they'd seen that form on the flag on Arjuna's chariot, and just by seeing that, and one could infer that there's some relishing in the mind of the beauty of Lord Krishna's form, they achieved liberation. Extraordinary. So Srila Prabhupada contrasts, there's the distressed, he describes, the needy, the intelligent, and the inquisitive, who have performed pious activities as beginning, and now they come to start to worship, or they're worshiping the Lord. And he contrasts that with persons who, and he uses this word, thrive on misdeeds, that they cannot approach the Lord because they've been misled by their illusory energy. So this is the contrast, who's actually able to and who isn't able to actually approach the Lord. So these generalizations, they have implications, because for the pious persons, if there's some calamity, there's no alternative other than to take shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord. So constantly remembering the lotus feet of the Lord means that one's preparing for liberation from birth and death. So Srila Prabhupada reaches a conclusion, and this is what Srila Prabhupada, how he concludes. Even though there are so-called calamities, they are welcome because they give us an opportunity to remember the Lord, which means liberation. So, I can apply it to my life because I thought about this a good amount, because maybe 3 years ago I had a major calamity in my devotional life. It wasn't something that I had chosen, but it came where something that I'd invested my life in. And, many sacrifices, many choices were made, always to actually make space for that service, an educational service, and that was removed. I could say not with my participation. In that kind of situation of, the mind being disturbed and feeling distress, I actually thought, okay, I have to make a choice how I'm going to actually look at this. So my thought was, well, the most important thing is certainly that I have to just constantly try very hard to remember Lord Krishna. So, because the instinct generally for persons, when there's some suffering that happens in the devotional realm, is to think, oh, well, I'll just go back to my material life, or I'll leave, or I'll do less of that, and I'll go back to something that gives me peace and I don't have to deal with the difficulty. So it's a much more difficult decision to make, to actually take shelter of the lotus feet of the Lord. One would think, oh, this is a natural progression, but actually one has to consciously do so. So, and the interesting thing is, again, thinking of how Srila Prabhupada is analyzing this whole way that persons are functioning when there's some piety, or their piety has led them to come to this point of worshipping Lord Krishna. He says one has to bear in mind that the material world is a dangerous place. It's actually full of calamities. So Srila Prabhupada again makes a contrast. He says that when persons are a little bit less intelligent, they're actually thinking that they're going to prepare different plans so that they can make adjustments for different calamities. But they're not knowing that the nature of the material world, or this place, is that it's full of calamities. So actually, you can't avoid it. But the sane person, so somebody who's actually like thinking rationally and understanding that actually they're in need of assistance, he has, or she has, the duty to be undisturbed by all the calamities in the material world. There's a duty if you're a more sane person, because you understand that's the nature of the place. I was reflecting, when one is in one's 20s, maybe, one is looking ahead to all the glorious things that await one in one's life. It's natural. And then as things start unfolding, so many unexpected difficulties come one's way. Things one never even imagined. So sometimes I guess there's some reactions one has to go through, but it's basically these calamities, some misfortune, some difficulty is there. So the duty, if one's a sane person, is not to get disturbed by those calamities or difficulties, because they're sure to happen. That's the point. In all circumstances, there's going to be difficulty. It's the nature of this material world, and it's a hard thing to come to grips with, but it's the factual thing. So if one's suffering all kinds of misfortune, one should make progress in spiritual realization, because that's actually the mission of human life. I mean, it's a very sad thing to think that one is actually trying to ignore the fact that there's constant difficulties in life and still thinking one's going to become free of those difficulties. It's a rather sad situation. So it's much better that if one has to go through suffering and confront different misfortune, one is still making progress in spiritual realization. So this is Lord Srila Prabhupada's kind of analysis in teachings of Queen Kunti, because he examines her prayers. And Srila Prabhupada goes on to say that all calamities are in fact the nature of dreams, which is interesting because, when you experience a difficulty, it feels very real. I mean, I remember having my body physically hurt at one point, and, it seemed very real. But Srila Prabhupada puts that all calamities are, in fact, of the nature of dreams, because the spirit soul is transcendental to those calamities. So you have to distance yourself and understand it that way. In text 9, there's a narration by Srila Prabhupada. This is from Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, where Srila Prabhupada's writing. So there's just a short section, a little verse that we read in text 9, where Queen Kunti said, "My dear Krishna, our welfare was assured only when you remembered us, your relatives, and gave us your protection by sending my brother to visit us." So Srila Prabhupada elaborates on this, and so I'm going to read his elaboration. He says, so Kunti's talking, "My dear Krishna, I remember the day you sent my brother Akura to gather information about us. This means that you always remember us automatically. When you sent Akura, I could understand that there was no possibility of our being put in danger. All good fortune in life began when you sent Akura to us. Since then, I have been convinced that we are not without protection. We may be put into various types of dangerous conditions by our family members, the Kurus, but I am confident that you remember us and always keep us safe and sound. Even ordinary devotees who simply think of you are always immune to all kinds of material danger, and what to speak of ourselves who are personally remembered by you. So, my dear Krishna, there's no question of bad luck. We are always in an auspicious position because of your grace. Yet, although you have bestowed a special favor to us, people should not mistakenly think that you are partial to some and inattentive to others. You make no such distinctions. No one is your favorite and no one is your enemy. As the Supreme Personality of Godhead, you are equal to everyone, and everyone can take advantage of your special protection. The fact is that although you are equal to everyone, you are especially inclined to the devotees who always think of you. The devotees are related to you by ties of love. As such, they cannot forget you for even a moment. You are present in everyone's heart, but because the devotees always remember you, you respond accordingly. I know certainly, my dear Krishna, that being seated in everyone's heart, you always create auspicious situations for your unalloyed devotees. So there's Queen Kunti giving her understanding of how she personally is experiencing this protection of Krishna. So even in difficulties, she's noticing there's some sign. Krishna sends a Kura. So she's understanding Krishna's remembering them. And just by that change in the whole scenario, she's understanding that Krishna's actually bringing auspiciousness to them, even in a dangerous situation. So, and then of course she also looks at the implication, well, if Krishna's appearing to bring something auspicious into their situations, does it mean that he's showing more favor to some people than to others? And she said that's not actually how Krishna is. He's actually equally favorable to everyone, but naturally where there's that connection, like devotees specifically thinking of Krishna, Krishna's remembering them. So it means that he's just responding accordingly. They remember Krishna, Krishna's remembering them. But she basically concludes that for his devotees, those that have that possessiveness about Krishna and not possessiveness for anything else, Krishna creates situations that are always auspicious for those devotees. So Srila Prabhupada puts it in the teachings of Queen Kunti this way. He says, the Pandavas are most fortunate because with all good luck, they were entirely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. So this is just reiterating this point that Queen Kunti is making. This was actually the fortune of the Pandavas, the fact that they were dependent on the mercy of the Lord. So like in the material world, to be dependent on the mercy of someone is a sign of great misfortune. I mean, to not be self-sufficient, to not be able to take care of oneself, to rely completely on somebody else. I mean, that's considered pretty misfortunate in the material world. But in the case of the transcendental relation with the Lord, it's the most fortunate case where you can live completely dependent on Lord Krishna. So you realize how brave you have to be, because it actually takes bravery, because you're fighting against how you're taught in the material world. In the material world, you don't want to be dependent on someone. It's not a good thing. I mean, you don't know if that person's going to remain with you, that person's going to remain loyal to you, so it's not considered such a good thing. But in the case of the Supreme Lord, it's actually quite an act of bravery to cultivate a dependence on him. So this is Srila Prabhupada. The highest achievement of human civilization is to work with valor, but at the same time depend completely on the Lord. So, in the material situation, dependence on somebody usually means that you're in a weak position, an incapable kind of, as in an incapable or incapacitated kind of situation. So there's the emphasis that in the transcendental realm, you're actually working with valor. So you're proceeding with bravery, you're performing your duties. So it's not a passive kind of dependence, it's a very active dependence, because you're performing all your external work that you have to perform, but internally there's that cultivation of dependence, complete dependence on the Lord, because you know that your strength to achieve, your capacity is dependent on the Lord's kindness upon you. So there's the mention of Srila Prabhupada. The Pandavas were highly qualified by personal character. So the character was very developed, and by physical activities. So they were highly qualified. But they always looked to the mercy of the Lord, because they knew that every living being is dependent on the Supreme Lord just by constitutional position. So these are some thoughts related to Queen Kunti's meeting with Lord Krishna and trying to extract something of what her position was and something of her internal meditations, and Srila Prabhupada's comments on this very interesting issue of cultivating complete dependence on the Lord and how that plays itself out. So if there's any thought on this subject matter.
I just thank you for class. And one question is in relation to your class. I'm wondering if you remember how it's stated about for one who I draw a blank on the first part, but the second part is for one who something something something. This whole ocean of nescience shrinks down to the size of the calf's footprint. What's the?
Yes.
Do you remember the first part? For one who is it meditates or
It's the
depends on.
same, exactly. That feeds exactly into this discussion. So it's the person's, I don't know the particular sentence you're thinking of, but it's that same idea for the persons who are cultivating this kind of complete dependence on the Lord. That's when all those calamities, difficulties of the material world are such that it's like a little pool of that fills a little circle. It's so easy to cross over the difficulties. Yeah.
That came to mind, and then I wanted to share one thing that my Guru Maharaj um, told me that I keep forgetting. He says, when it comes to doing your service, executing your service, this like he gives you an instruction. He says, always pray as if everything depends upon Krishna and act as if everything depends upon you. So that's something he personally told me. He says, pray as if everything depends upon Krishna. And after, praying like, completely dependent on Krishna, then act as if everything depends upon you.
That's a very nice translation. Yeah, very nice. Thanks, Vaishnav. Both thoughts fed perfectly into the discussion. Thank you.
I was just curious to understand how one is supposed to give up family ties. Like I know, like for men, they have sannyasi and vanaprastha, so they can just leave away. But for women, women's body, it's not so easy to be able to release those attachments, especially to family relations, like Queen Kunti did. And so, to be in that position, like how can we, within this mundane world, comprehend as women how to do something like that?
Yes, it's a very significant question. How in the material world do you actually, um, sort of go through that kind of, I guess, aspiration to cut off the ties with family members, because that's what's been described of Queen Kunti. Well, the interesting thing is that through cultivating that dependence on Lord Krishna, there's a certain intelligence that comes where one can see everything in perspective. So one understands, I have a relationship with this particular relative, that particular relative, this partner, whatever it may be, this dependent. Um, and one understands at the same time that those particular persons that one's attached to, they're also part and parcel of Lord Krishna. So there's a natural kind of respect for the relationship that one has with those persons because they're also part and parcel of Lord Krishna. And with that kind of attitude of respect to those persons, one actually treats them as Krishna's property. So by functioning in that way with the different persons that one is related to in different kinds of relationships, there's always a reserve, an internal reserve where one is conscious of the fact that one is functioning also serving Krishna in that relationship. So it takes it to a much higher level. It's not on the level of what do I need to do for this person? What does this person need to do for me? And then all the ego-related things that come into that kind of equation. Like, I don't like that I was treated this way, or I'm cross with this one, or whatever it is. It's not on that level. It's on a level of great respect and consciousness of doing one's duty within the relationship according to the nature of the relationship in a very respectful, conscious way. And just by functioning in that kind of way, it brings into balance that what would normally be on a material level, like, extreme attachment. It's not like that. It's always a proper kind of mental, emotional space that's occupied with having the correct understanding. So it doesn't mean, that, you now get rid of those people. That's not the idea. It's the idea is that you function with the correct understanding. And just having the correct understanding puts everything into balance. And it's a fine balance. And one appreciates the persons and they appreciate oneself, but it's always respectful. It never goes into an ugly space. Because, you see persons on the material level, like, I remember sort of growing up in a home where my parents had like disputes regularly. One has a particular manner, the other has a different manner, and then the different manners would collide, and they'd have a little dispute. That doesn't happen where there's respectful mood and understanding of the nature of the relationship in relation to Lord Krishna and one's duty to him, and how those persons also have a role. Sometimes they don't know, it doesn't matter. Just approaching it oneself in the correct way puts things in proper balance. It never goes an ugly route.
Yes, in relation to that, I'm just thinking it takes a level of like intelligence and also like self-awareness and maturity within an individual to understand how to even show up for, within a relationship, recognizing that this is Krishna's property and knowing what those needs are in order to facilitate, their growth for Krishna. Like that's not something that seems so easily.
Yes, one has to go step by step. Things become apparent because one's practicing Krishna consciousness. Krishna gives intelligence where you come to recognize things at particular moments, and then you make adjustments mentally and emotionally and according to the circumstances. It's a very dynamic process. It's not that, you have a belief and then you're blind, because that would be material. Rather, it's one has the understanding, and then Krishna, because you're working in relation to Krishna, that connection with Krishna, the dependence on him, he provides some intelligence where something becomes very graphic. Oh, this needs attention. Oh, let me look at this. How am I viewing this? Oh, maybe I need to make an adjustment. Maybe I need to grow in this area. What can I do a little bit differently? And then, you really think about it and start making little changes. And just because one is approaching everything in a conscious manner, so you'll find that everything around you starts changing too. Even if persons are not practicing Krishna consciousness themselves, just by virtue of the fact that oneself is acting consciously, many person situations start changing. So, but it's a dynamic thing. And step by step, Krishna reveals something at different times. And then you, in a dynamic way, conscious way, you look at it each time something is revealed. I think Deja had something else you wanted to ask. Sorry,
I was just wondering what the verse was that you were quoting about a devotee like has shame to ask like the Lord for like self-interest, things for self-interest. You had made that quote earlier in the class about a devotee like not wanting to approach the Lord for his own self-interest.
The particular statement was that yes, the pure devotee is ashamed to ask something that's based on self-interest. Yeah. I mean, the consciousness is so developed. So there's the understanding that if one's dependent on the Lord, then it's going to be His will that's going to dictate how a particular situation, circumstance is. So one would be a bit ashamed to say, well, look, I want it this way. Yeah.
I think I might have forgot.
Oh, that's fine. We can speak later then. Okay. Thank you very much. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.